Hello and welcome to the Commander's Quarters, your Magic the Gathering source that helps you command your budget. This show and episodes like this one are possible thanks to viewers like you. If you're looking for an easy way to help support this show, make sure that you like, share, and subscribe. Also, hit that bell notification icon so you don't miss any new episodes. You can also go check out our playmats and other merchandise at thecommandersquarters.com. Another easy way to support this show is with our TCG player affiliate links. So whether you're buying a deck or individual cards, you can use this general link right here or one in the description. And the final way that you can support this show is by supporting us directly by becoming a patron. There are many benefits to being a patron, and I truly couldn't do this without all their support. And also, the Search for the Ancient Bauble Kickstarter has launched, so make sure you go check that out. The Kickstarter campaign will last for 30 days, and after that, the playmat will no longer be available for purchase. Hey everyone, Mitch coming in from the Commander's Quarters studio. Welcome to the show. So, Modern Horizons 2 spoiler season is finally coming to a close, but we're still seeing some exciting and interesting new cards like Soul Talisman. So, if you haven't seen the episode on it, make sure you check it out, because on that episode, I answer the question, is this another Soul Ring? Also, if you haven't seen my episode on Dothy Voidwalker, make sure you check that one out as well, because this Voidwalker might just be the most overpowered card of the entire set. And make sure you check out my most recent episode on Nykthos Exemplar, who actually makes life gain powerful now. But make sure you check out those episodes after this one, because you'd make Goblin Anarchomancer very sad if you left. That's right, we've got yet another Goblin Mancer. You know, like Goblin Electromancer, but now this is Anarchomancer. Anyways, let's jump into it. So, Goblin Anarchomancer, which, okay, one second. I assume that term basically means like an anarchy mancer of some sort, some kind of a magical anarchy goblin. Okay? If you know what Anarchomancer really means, please let me know in the comments below. But anyways, let's continue. It's a 2/2 Goblin Shaman that costs red-green, and it says each spell you cast that's red or green costs 1 less to cast. So this card is most definitely a callback to the very similar and very popular Goblin Electromancer. Goblin Electromancer is a 2/2 Goblin Wizard that costs blue-red that says instant sorcery spells you cast cost 1 less to cast. So obviously each are 2/2 goblins that cost 2 mana, and they reduce the cost of certain spells. Now, as I mentioned, Goblin Electromancer is quite popular. In fact, it sees play in 11% of eligible decks. Reducing the cost of your instant sorcery spells is good, who knew? Now, does that mean that Goblin Anarchomancer is going to see a similar amount of play? In my opinion, probably not. Now, that doesn't mean that it's not going to see a good amount of play though. Let's talk about the advantages and disadvantages of each of these cards in comparison to each other. Goblin Anarchomancer reduces the cost of every single one of your red or green spells. So unlike the Electromancer, obviously it can affect other things like enchantments or planeswalkers or creatures, etc, etc. But Anarchomancer is limited to just red or green spells, whereas Goblin Electromancer affects all of your instant and sorcery spells no matter what color they are. That being said, the vast majority of decks that utilize Goblin Electromancer are Izzet decks. But obviously it has the option to extend outside of those colors and aid them as well. But one key difference between these two cards might just be the types of decks that really want to utilize cost reduction. Many Izzet decks are spellslinger decks, and like the name applies, you want to sling a bunch of spells. And in that case, when you're saying spells for a spell slinging deck, you're utilizing instant sorcery spells. So by reducing their cost, you can spell sling more. Are you tired of hearing me say spell sling? Me too. So, Izzet decks typically are looking to cast a lot of spells in a turn, and Goblin Electromancer can help you do that. Now, not that that isn't a priority for Gruul, but it's not anywhere near as a priority as it is for Izzet. So although Goblin Anarchomancer is more effective within its colors at reducing the cost of spells, its colors aren't really focused on spell slinging. Now that doesn't mean that it can't be really effective and help you out throughout the game. I mean, this kind of cost reduction can save you a ton of mana. In comparison to something like, say, a Mana Dork, this can be more impactful throughout the game. Yes, Mana Dorks can help you cast spells, but by reducing the cost, you can cast more spells in a turn. Now, Goblin Electromancer is a heavily played card for a reason, and I'm definitely not trying to downplay the potential for Goblin Anarchomancer. Anarchomancer, I believe, is still going to see a good amount of play, and there are plenty of commanders out there that can really utilize a card like this. We'll get to those here in a bit though, but first let's talk about some other comparable cards. And the first cards that came to mind were the very effective and very expensive Ruby Medallion and Emerald Medallion. Ruby Medallion is an artifact for 2 that says red spells you cast cost 1 less to cast. And similarly, Emerald Medallion is also an artifact for 2 that says green spells you cast cost 1 less to cast. So essentially, Goblin Anarchomancer is kind of like a creature version combination of these two. Again, a key difference though is that each of these isn't limited to being in Gruul's colors. Ruby Medallion especially sees a ton of play in mono-red decks, and unfortunately, Goblin Anarchomancer can't help out there because of the green. That being said, when a card is being compared to Electromancer and these two medallions, it's going to be in good company. Again, cost reduction can save you an absurd amount of mana throughout the game, and it can really help you cast a lot more spells in a turn. So although our Anarchomancer is more limited in that it can only go in decks that have both red and green, it can still have a high impact on those kinds of decks. But now let's move on and talk about another somewhat comparable card with another Goblin with Dragonlord Servant. Dragonlord Servant is a 1/3 Goblin Shaman that costs 1 in a red and it says dragon spells you cast cost 1 less to cast. This card sees a ton of play in Dragon decks because again it's helping you reduce the cost of those spells. And we'll talk about a specific Dragon commander later where this and Anarchomancer can really help out. But again, just think about the impact that this has on a Dragon deck. It's reducing the cost of a very specific type of spell in that deck, and yes, you do run a lot of those, but you're running other spells as well. So this does reduce the cost of your dragons, but it's not reducing the cost of any of your enchantments, or your instants, or your sorceries, etc, etc. Whereas for a Gruul deck, the Anarchomancer is going to be reducing the cost of all of your spells essentially, except for probably artifacts, though there are some artifacts that are red or green, but anyways, you know what I mean. And Gruul decks typically don't run that many artifacts anyways. You don't need to depend on things like mana rocks because, well, you're in green and you've got the best land ramp spells. So if you're in a Gruul deck, the Anarchomancer can pretty much reduce the cost of all the spells in your deck. Let's talk about two final comparison cards though that are actually artifacts themselves with Ronus' Monument and Hazoret's Monument. Ronus' Monument says green creature spells you cast cost 1 less to cast, and wherever you cast a creature spell, target creature you control gets +2/+2 and gains trample till end of turn. And then Hazoret's Monument's gonna reduce the cost of red creature spells you cast by 1 and says whenever you cast a creature spell you may discard a card, if you do, draw a card. So this is cost reduction as well, but more specific cost reduction. Like the Anarchomancer, they're focused on colors, but only for creature spells. That being said, each of these do have an extra benefit whenever you cast any creature spell. But again, there are plenty of decks out there where the cost reduction aspect of these is huge. But now let's move on and talk about the potential impact of that cost reduction by going through certain spells. Simply by having the Anarchomancer in play, you are cutting the cost in half for spells like Rampant Growth, Elvish Visionary, and Heroic Intervention. In case you've never played a green deck in Commander, Rampant Growth is a sorcery for 1 in a green that says search your library for a basic land card, put that card onto the battlefield, tap, then shuffle your library. Essentially, this is where the term ramp came from, going to go get a land and putting it into play. Now, Rampant Growth is already very efficient, being a 2-mana ramp spell that gets you 1 land. But now with the Anarchomancer in play, it's twice as efficient, only costing 1 mana to ramp a land. So if you've got a deck that has a ton of ramp spells in it, yeah, that can help out a lot. You can cast more ramp spells in a turn to go get you more and more lands, to next turn cast more ramp spells to get more and more lands, and things get out of control very quickly. Or how about Elvish Visionary, a 1/1 Elf Shaman for 1 in a green that says when it enters the battlefield, draw a card. Again, Anarchomancer only makes this cost a green, so now it's essentially a cantrip on a creature. And a 1/1 that only costs 1 that draws you a card when it comes into play is pretty fantastic. And speaking of fantastic, there's Heroic Intervention, which is an instant for 1 in a green that says permanents you control gain hexproof and indestructible until end of turn. Now at 2 mana, this is already an absurd card that protects your entire team from basically anything. But now thanks to your Anarchomancer, you only need to keep a green mana up for this, which is just insane. Someone casts a Wrath, then you save your entire team for just 1 mana and everyone else's board is well gone. And then in red, how about cards like Seething Song, Thrill Possibility, and Chaos Warp? Seething Song and other rituals like it can be fantastic with a cost reducer. It's an instant for 2 in a red and it says add red, 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 red. Basically, 5 red. So normally you'd be paying 3 mana to make 5, but thanks to the Anarchomancer, that's gonna be 2 mana to make 5. That is a much greater return for your investment, and this can help you cast even more spells in a turn. And then Thrill Possibility is an instant for 1 in a red that says additional cost to cast this spell, discard a card, draw 2 cards. Again, this is already an efficient card at 2 mana, but again with Anarchomancer, it's twice as efficient. It essentially becomes a 1 mana cantrip that helps you dig further into your deck and ditch a card that you don't need in your hand. Or how about everyone's favorite Chaos Warp? It's an instant for 2 in a red that says the owner of target permanent shovels it into their library, then reveals the top card of their library. If it's a permanent card, he or she puts it onto the battlefield. So this is your panic button and catch-all, get rid of whatever you need. This card sees a ton of play, and yeah, 3 mana getting rid of anything is going to be well worth that risk. But at 2 mana, it's going to be even better. But now let's move on and talk about some commanders that are really going to want to consider the Anarchomancer. And the first one that most definitely comes to mind is Wart the Raid Mother. Wart is a 3/3 Goblin Shaman that costs 4 Gruul. She has, when she enters the battlefield, create 2 1/1 red and green Goblin Warrior creature tokens. And each red or green instant or sorcery spell you cast has Conspire. So as you cast a spell, you may tap 2 untapped creatures you control that share a color with it, and when you do, you copy it, you may choose new targets for the copy. So Wart is all about casting spells and copying them and casting more spells and copying them, and you see where this is going. So yeah, a cost reducer like Goblin Anarchomancer can fit right in and be a fantastic card in this kind of a deck. Because with the Anarchomancer in play, you can sling even more spells and copy even more spells and have absurd turns. Next up though, let's talk about a very different commander from this one with Neith of the Dire Hunt. She's a 3/3 human warrior that costs 2 green. And she says whenever 1 or more creatures you control fight or become blocked, draw a card. And at the beginning of combat on your turn, you may pay 2 Gruul. If you do, double target creature's power until end of turn, and that creature must be blocked this combat if able. So many Neith decks out there are all about casting a ton of fight spells and drawing a lot of cards from that. So again, by reducing the cost of your fight spells with the Anarchomancer, you can cast more and more of them in a turn, drawing more cards, casting more fight spells, and controlling the board. But now let's move on to Halar the Firefletcher, a 3/3 elf archer with trample that costs 1 red-green. And whenever you cast a spell, if that spell was kicked, put a ++1 counter on Halar the Firefletcher, then Halar deals damage equal to the number of ++1 counters on it to each opponent. So with this kind of a deck, you're looking to increase Halar's power and then cast a lot of kick spells. Again, by reducing the cost of those spells, it's easier to grow Halar's power more quickly and to cast more kick spells in a turn. Next up, how about a big mana commander like Grand Warlord Radha? Grand Warlord Radha is a 3/4 hasty elf warrior that costs 2 red-green. She has whenever 1 or more creatures you control attack, add that much mana in any combination of red and or green. Until end of turn, you don't lose this mana as steps and phases end. So with this commander, not only can your Anarchomancer reduce your mana, but it can also actually give you mana too if you attack with it. Now you might want to make sure that your Anarchomancer is safe when you do so, but there are plenty of ways to do that with this kind of a deck. So you attack with a bunch of creatures, you make a ton of mana, and now you can cast an absurd number of spells thanks to your Anarchomancer in your second main phase. And speaking of absurd amounts of mana, of course there's Nikya of the Old Ways. Nikya is a 5/5 Centaur Druid that costs 3 red-green. She says you can't cast non-creature spells, but whenever you tap a land for mana, add 1 mana of any type that land produced. So because you can't cast your typical non-creature spells, most of the time you're not going to be depending on those land ramp spells that you typically do in these types of decks, like Rampant Growth. But what you can rely on are creatures that help you out with mana, and Goblin Anarchomancer can be fantastic with this kind of a deck. You can produce a ton of mana and cast even more creatures in a turn thanks to your Goblin Anarchomancer. In a similar way, let's talk about Rurikthar the Unbound. Rurikthar is a 6/6 Ogre Warrior with Vigilance and Reach that costs 4 red-green. It attacks each combat if able, and whenever a player casts a non-creature spell, Rurikthar deals 6 damage to that player. So whereas Nikya doesn't let you cast non-creature spells, Rurikthar does let you, but just punishes you a ton, so you're probably not going to do it anyways. So again, similarly, Goblin Anarchomancer can be a fantastic creature for this type of a deck. But now let's talk about Omnath, Locus of Rage. Omnath is a 5/5 elemental that costs 3 red, green. It has landfall. Whenever land enters the battlefield under your control, create a 5/5 red and green elemental creature token. And whenever Omnath Locus of Rage or another elemental you control dies, Omnath deals 3 damage to any target. So Omnath decks are looking to ramp, and ramp some more by getting a ton of lands in play. So again, like I mentioned before when talking about Rampant Growth, Goblin Anarchomancer can be fantastic for this type of commander. By reducing the cost of your ramp spells, you can cast more of them in a turn to get more lands to cast even more in the next turn. And the final commander that I want to bring up is one that I alluded to earlier with Atarka World Render. It's a 6/4 dragon with flying and trample that costs 5 red-green. It has whenever a dragon you control attacks, it gains double strike until end of turn. Dragon Lord Servant sees play in over 70% of Atarka decks. And again, unlike Goblin Anarchomancer, it's just reducing the cost of your dragons, not your other spells. So the Anarchomancer can have an even bigger impact on this kind of a deck. But now it's time for me to wrap things up and give you my final thoughts on Goblin Anarchomancer. This card can have a high impact on a lot of decks out there. Now, while it probably won't see as much play as, say, Goblin Electromancer, that doesn't mean that it's not going to be a good card. Cost reduction is a very powerful thing, and it can save you a lot of mana throughout the game and can help you cast more and more spells. So I think a lot of Gruul commanders out there should be considering this for their deck. And with that, the show is coming to a close, so it's my turn to hear from you. So the comments below, let me know what your thoughts on this episode are, and as always, thanks again and have a good one.